The war had ended, or at least that was what the papers said. Smoke still clung to the horizon, and the air in Kentucky was heavy with the kind of silence that comes after too much screaming. Elias Vance rode home through the ash fields, the sound of his horse's hooves muffled by the charred earth. He had seen towns burned to bone, farms stripped bare, graves dug by hands too tired to tremble anymore. Yet when he reached the edge of his family's land, it was as though the war had never touched it. The Vance estate stood whole. The fences were mended, the windows unbroken, and the fields, and impossibly were green. Not the weak pale green of early spring, but a deep lush shade that seemed to drink the light. The garden spread like a wound that refused to close, breathing quietly in the sun. Elias dismounted and stood before it, feeling the strange weight in the air. The soil was darker than he remembered, thick and damp like freshly spilled ink. Even the air smelled alive, almost metallic. His boots sank deeper than they should have, and for a moment he thought he felt a pulse beneath his feet. He told himself it was only his heartbeat, still unsteady from the ride. The Vance house loomed ahead, the white columns gleaming, the shutters closed like sleeping eyes. No smoke rose from the chimney. No sound came from the kitchen. Yet something about the house felt awake, quietly watching, quietly waiting. When he stepped inside, dust did not greet him. Everything was polished, arranged, preserved. His mother's porcelain tea set was laid out on the table as if the family had just stepped away. The faint scent of lavender still clung to the air, but beneath it lay another smell, earthy and sweet, like decaying leaves after rain. Elias felt both comforted and repelled. It was home, yet it wasn't. Every room held the stillness of a painting. Every mirror reflected him too clearly, as if the glass had been recently cleaned. He called out for his mother, his sister, anyone, but the house absorbed his voice without echo. Outside, the wind brushed the garden, and something in it shifted. The plants bent slightly toward him, not with the breeze but against it. Elias watched the movement, rhythmic, deliberate, too synchronized to be natural. He told himself exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. After years of death, maybe he had forgotten what living things looked like. Yet the closer he looked, the more he saw that the garden was not growing in rows anymore. It spread outward, creeping beyond its borders, small veins of roots cracking through stone paths. Beneath the vines, he could swear he saw small mounds, uneven shapes that rose and sank as if the earth was breathing. He knelt down, pressed his hand to the soil, and felt warmth. It pulsed, faint, steady, like something dreaming beneath him. He stayed like that for a long time, his hand on the ground, his mind searching for reason. The war had left him skeptical of everything holy, but he whispered a prayer anyway. When he stood again, the sun was lower, its light bleeding across the fields. He saw his mother then, standing by the porch, her figure still and white against the dark garden. Her smile was calm, almost relieved, as if she had been expecting him not today but forever. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The air between them was thick with the same scent, the earth, the sweetness, the metallic tang that caught in his throat. She turned and walked back inside, and Elias followed because that's what sons did when they had nothing else left. That night he lay in his old room, unable to sleep. The cicadas outside hummed in rhythm, like a chant too old to translate. He tried to think of the soldiers who had not come home, the fields he had crossed, the bodies he had buried without names. Yet the only image that stayed with him was the garden, lush and wrong and breathing. The moonlight spilled through the window, touching the wallpaper, the bedposts, the small wooden cross nailed above the door. And then he saw it, a faint shimmer on the floorboards like moisture seeping up from below. He touched it with his fingers. It was warm, slick, and carried that same earthy scent. He wiped it away quickly, pretending not to see that it stained his hand dark. Before dawn, he went outside again. Mist covered the ground like a thin shroud. The garden was alive in ways it shouldn't be. Vines stretching, flowers opening and closing like mouths whispering in sleep. He thought he heard a sound, soft and human, beneath the soil. Not a cry, but something slower, like a sigh that never ended. The wind rustled the trees and the soil shifted again, exhaling a faint mist that glittered in the early light. Elias felt dizzy. He told himself it was the memory of war, the exhaustion of survival. But deep down, a small voice told him the truth, that the land did not merely survive the war. It had fed on it, When the sun rose, the garden shone with a terrible beauty, each leaf catching the light like glass. His mother stood at the edge, her hands folded, her face turned toward the growing day. She whispered something he couldn't hear. Then she knelt, pressing her palm gently to the ground. The soil accepted it, almost hungrily. Elias watched, frozen, as she smiled faintly, her breath steady, serene, as though she were communing with something sacred. And in that quiet moment, the garden seemed to sigh again, satisfied, as if it had just been fed. Elias did not understand what had taken root in that place, only that it was older than war, older than peace, and not meant for human knowing. As the morning light spread, he looked at the soil, that living, breathing soil, and for the first time since the war ended, he was afraid of what had survived. By the winter of 1866, the war had faded into story, and grief had become a kind of habit in Kentucky. The dead were too many to mourn properly, and the living learned to swallow sorrow like medicine, quietly, without complaint. Margaret Vance understood this better than anyone. When her husband's body was found in the garden that spring, pale and oddly preserved, she did not cry. She arranged the burial herself, selected a coffin of pale oak, and saw to it that no doctor examined the corpse. At the funeral, her composure drew whispers. Some called it strength, others vanity. But those who met her eyes said there was something there, not sadness, not peace, but something watchful, as though she had traded emotion for control. When the first widow's banquet was announced that autumn, it seemed an act of charity. Margaret sent invitations to 7 women whose husbands had died in the war. Fine paper, handwritten, sealed with wax embossed with the Vance crest. Each message promised comfort, company, and a meal to honor the fallen with life. No one refused her. The Vance estate had survived when others starved, and Margaret herself was a figure of grace, tall, slender, wrapped in mourning black that never dulled her beauty. People said she looked like marble, smooth, cold, unchanging. The night of the first banquet, the house glowed with warm lamplight. The dining table stretched long enough to seat 20, but only 7 came. Each woman carried grief like a second skin, trembling hands, hollow eyes, voices cracked from years of silence. Margaret welcomed them with a smile that reached her lips but not her eyes. She spoke softly of healing, of finding sweetness again in life's bitterness. Her words were precise, each sentence measured, every pause deliberate. When she served the food, it was beautiful. Roasted pheasant glazed in honey, wine as dark as blood, bread baked in shapes of vines. The guests ate slowly, then greedily. One woman remarked that she had never tasted such tenderness in meat, such warmth in the wine. Margaret only smiled and said that true flavor was born of patience. After the meal, she led them into the garden. The night air was heavy with scent, earth, lilac, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. The widows stood among the glowing leaves, weeping quietly. Margaret told them that grief could be replanted, that every sorrow had its use if placed in the right soil. When the women left the next morning, they looked changed, lighter, almost luminous. But by the end of the week, 2 had vanished. Their families said they had gone north to start anew. Margaret sent condolences and baskets of fruit. Each year the tradition continued. More invitations, more banquets, more disappearances. The town began to talk. Some said Margaret was helping the widows move on in ways only a woman could understand. Others whispered that she used herbs to calm their suffering, powders from the garden that softened pain until it forgot to end. But the ones who worked in her kitchen knew differently. They saw the way she treated ingredients like secrets, the way she weighed, measured, and labeled everything with letters instead of names. The pantry was lined with glass jars, each filled with something pale and powdered, sealed tight, stacked in perfect symmetry. She never let anyone else touch them. When she cooked, it was like watching a ritual. Her movements were graceful, exact, the flick of a wrist, the soft press of a blade. There was no warmth in her work, only devotion. She murmured to herself as she stirred, as if reciting prayers or formulas. Her hands never shook. She believed emotion spoiled the balance of flavor. The servant said she could tell when someone entered the kitchen just by the change in air, and that she once dismissed a girl simply for breathing too loudly near the stew. The banquets became quieter, smaller. Fewer women came each year, though the invitations never stopped. By the 5th year, only 3 widows attended. Margaret's hair had silvered, but her face remained ageless. The guests spoke little, their voices subdued as if afraid of disturbing the stillness. When the meal was done, Margaret asked them to write the names of their husbands on folded slips of paper. She took the slips into the garden and buried them beneath the roots of the oldest rosebush. The next morning, the flowers had opened wider than ever before. Their scent was sharp and heavy, almost suffocating. The widows left before sunrise, pale and silent. None were seen again. The town grew cautious of the Vance estate. Children dared each other to run past the gates, but no one entered. Yet every spring new blooms appeared, thick, red, and impossible in their beauty. The soil beneath them glistened as if fed by something more than rain. Margaret continued her routine, writing letters, tending the garden, arranging new feasts. She moved through the world with the poise of someone who had mastered her grief and learned to use it. When asked why she still held banquets after so many had vanished, she said only that sorrow had to be consumed, or it would consume everything else. Behind her words was a method only she understood. She saw human emotion not as burden but as ingredient. Sorrow boiled down, despair fermented, love preserved until it lost its warmth and turned useful. Each death, each disappearance, each tear shed beneath her garden's roots was part of a recipe perfected by patience. The town called her merciful. The soil called her mother. And when the wind swept across the fields at night, it carried the faintest echo of voices. Not screams, not prayers, just whispers rising from beneath the roses, asking quietly to be fed again. By the time Henry Vance turned 9, the garden had become his playground and his teacher. He spent hours sitting in its shade with a pencil and paper, sketching what he saw or what he thought he saw. His mother, Margaret, encouraged the habit at first. It kept him quiet. It kept him close. He would sit cross-legged near the oldest rose bush, his small fingers blackened with graphite, his eyes too wide for his age. The drawings began innocently enough, flowers, fences, birds perched on the fence posts, but soon they changed. The flowers took on shapes that didn't belong to them, their petals curling into fingers, their stems bending like limbs. Then came the faces. The first face appeared in a sketch of the garden's center, faint and small, hidden in the soil's shading. It was turned upward, eyes closed as if sleeping beneath the earth. When Margaret found it among his papers, she felt a chill crawl up her throat. She told herself it was childish imagination, the strange residue of grief his young mind could not name. She folded the drawing neatly and placed it in the drawer with the family's documents. But Henry kept drawing. Each day he came in with more sketches, lines darker, strokes sharper. The faces multiplied, the bodies intertwining with vines that crawled through their ribs and down into unseen roots. Some mouths were open, some seemed to smile. And the longer he stared at the soil, the more certain he became that he was only copying what was already there. At night, Henry dreamed of breathing earth. In his sleep, he could feel the dirt pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with warmth instead of air. He would wake gasping, his fingernails packed with soil. Margaret told him they were nightmares. That war and widowhood had filled the world with too many ghosts, and sometimes children could sense what adults refused to see. But she never told him to stop drawing. She simply locked each new page away, one by one, in her desk beside the family Bible. It was late summer when the priest came. Father Alden was a small man with trembling hands, sent by the diocese to bless the estate still standing after the war. He arrived dusty and pale, carrying a book and a brass cross. Margaret welcomed him politely, offering tea in her coldest smile. When she introduced Henry, the boy sat silent, eyes lowered, a pencil tucked behind his ear. The priest tried to speak kindly to him, asking about his studies, his drawings. Henry only said, "I draw what the garden shows me." The words were soft, but they seemed to scrape against the quiet room. Father Alden laughed uncertainly, calling it a poet's fancy. Yet something in the boy's stillness made him uneasy. After tea, Margaret led him outside for the blessing. The garden was at its fullest, thick with bloom and shadow. The priest began to pray, sprinkling holy water in the air. The droplets shimmered briefly before sinking into the ground. The scent of earth grew stronger, sweet, metallic, almost human. As he stepped closer to the rosebush, Father Alden faltered. The soil was pulsing softly, rising and falling in rhythm as though something beneath it was breathing. His words stuttered. Sweat ran down his neck. The air seemed too warm. Then, without warning, he doubled over and vomited into the dirt. The water flask fell from his hand and the prayer book slipped from his grasp. The sound was small, but it carried through the silent garden like a confession. Margaret said nothing. She merely handed him a cloth, her eyes calm, her smile unbroken. The priest mumbled apologies, blaming the heat. But when he left that afternoon, he did not look back at the house. That night, Henry sat by his window with a candle and drew what he had seen. The priest kneeling, his hands sunk in the soil, vines coiling gently around his wrists. The faces in the earth watched him with hollow eyes. Henry added their mouths, their whispers curling upward like smoke. He didn't know why, but it felt right. When Margaret found the drawing the next morning, she stared at it for a long time. She said softly that he should never show anyone such things, that people might misunderstand what grows naturally from sorrow. She pressed her lips to his forehead, but her hands trembled slightly when she took the paper away. The drawings continued through autumn. Henry began to name the faces in secret, using initials he remembered from whispered conversations in town. Widows, workers, visitors who had come and not returned. He didn't understand the connection, but he felt it deep inside him, the way a child feels a storm before it comes. The garden whispered to him sometimes, not in words but in breath, soft vibrations in the soil that pulsed up through his knees when he sat close enough. He began to sketch faster, as if the ground itself were dictating each stroke. When he showed one of the maids a new drawing, she screamed. The next morning she was gone. Margaret told Henry she had gone home to her sick mother. By winter, the drawings had filled half the locked drawer. Margaret burned a few when the boy wasn't looking, but the smell clung to her hands, a sickly sweetness that soap couldn't remove. She began to fear her son's quiet eyes, the way he looked at her sometimes as though she too were part of his sketches. She wanted to ask him what he saw when he looked at her, but she never found the courage. Instead, she watched him from the parlor window as he played in the garden, his pale head bent over the dirt, the candlelight flickering behind his small, steady form. On the coldest night of December, Henry drew his final picture of the year. In it, the garden was open, roots spreading outward like veins, and beneath them lay figures intertwined. Men, women, and children, faces serene, eyes closed, their skin threaded with vines that shimmered faintly as if alive. Above them stood a woman with long silver hair, her hand pressed to the earth, her smile both gentle and cruel. He did not know why he drew her, only that she felt familiar. When the candle burned low, he folded the page and slipped it under his pillow. As he drifted to sleep, the house creaked softly, like wood shifting under weight. The wind outside whispered through the garden, carrying the faintest sound of movement, roots stretching deeper, searching, hungrier than before. The Vance house had aged without rotting. Its wood was still strong, its foundation steady, but the air beneath it, the dark crawl of the cellar, had begun to smell faintly wrong. A slow, damp sweetness drifted upward through the cracks in the boards, especially when the rain came. Margaret Vance noticed it in the spring of 1869. She called it the garden's breath, and at first she said nothing. But when the odor deepened into something like spoiled fruit, she hired a local handyman, Thomas Gray, to make repairs. He arrived one humid morning carrying a hammer, a chisel, and the ordinary faith of a man who had fixed many old houses. The cellar door was narrow, half buried in the garden's shadow. Margaret guided him there herself, her gloved hand holding a small lantern. She told him the boards had warped from the damp, that she simply wanted them reinforced. Thomas nodded politely, though the thought of entering the earth beneath her feet made his skin itch. The air around her always smelled faintly metallic, like rust hidden under perfume. She lingered a moment longer than necessary before handing him the lantern. "Be careful with what you find," she said softly, her voice almost kind. "Some things in old houses don't like to be disturbed." He thought she was only joking, the kind of thing wealthy people said to sound mysterious. He laughed once, then descended the steps. The cellar swallowed the sound whole. It was cooler down there, but the air hung heavy, wet. Dust floated through the lantern's glow, turning the light thick and yellow. The room itself seemed ordinary enough. Stone walls, wooden beams, shelves lined with jars of preserves, old furniture shrouded in cloth. But when Thomas stepped onto the floor, the boards groaned as if the house exhaled beneath him. He crouched and tapped one, hollow. He worked carefully, prying up planks one by one. The first few revealed only dirt, compacted and dark. Then the smell grew sharper, sweet, rotting, familiar in a way that made him think of orchards long neglected. He lifted another board and found a small linen sack wedged between joists. It was damp to the touch, tied neatly with string. The surface was mottled, almost greasy, like fruit that had been dried and pressed. On the fabric were faint black letters, MV, Harvest 1866. Thomas frowned, thinking it must be some sort of herbal storage, roots maybe, or poultices. The weight inside was uneven, soft in places, firm in others. He turned it over and something inside shifted with a quiet, fleshy sound. He almost dropped it. He found more. Dozens of them. Each sack tucked carefully between beams, some labeled with other initials, HV, CB, LM, each marked with a harvest year. The pattern was too exact to be random. Every bundle was catalogued, placed as if following a plan. He pulled one open with the corner of his chisel, just enough to see. Inside was pulp, reddish-brown, fibrous, laced with strands that looked like roots or veins. The smell was not decay exactly. It was too preserved, too deliberate, like something half kept alive. Thomas covered it quickly and sat back on his heels, his pulse hammering. The lantern flickered. He became aware of the silence above him, the kind that was too heavy to be empty. He thought of calling for Mrs. Vance, but stopped. He couldn't explain what he'd found without sounding mad. He decided to leave the boards loose, tell her the repairs were done, and never return. But when he turned toward the stairs, he saw her standing at the top, the lantern light behind her forming a halo of pale fire. Her face was calm, expressionless, her gloved hands folded before her. "I trust the foundation is sound," she said. It was not a question. Thomas stammered something about moisture, about replacing boards. Margaret descended 2 steps, slow and steady. "You must understand," she said quietly. "Our family believes in keeping what nourishes us close. The war took much. We do not waste what remains." Her eyes flicked toward the floor where the loose boards gaped open. "That is not rot you smell, Mr. Gray, it's medicine. The kind you do not find in bottles." He tried to answer, but his mouth was dry. The air pressed tighter around him, and the sweet scent thickened. Margaret smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant the conversation was over. "You may finish your work tomorrow," she said. "The evening air is too damp now." She turned and left, her steps soft, her shadow gliding up the wall like smoke. Thomas climbed out of the cellar, breathing hard. He told himself he would come back at first light, collect his tools, and leave before she woke. But the garden watched him as he crossed it, the leaves shifting though no wind blew. That night he stayed in the servants' quarters at her insistence. He couldn't sleep. From the window he could see the faint glow of lanterns moving near the garden, slow circles of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the earth. He thought he heard shovels scraping, soft murmurs beneath the soil. When he closed his eyes, the smell of the sacks returned, the sweetness, the wrongness, the faint whisper of something still alive in the pulp. By morning, Thomas Gray was gone. The workers who came later found his tools neatly arranged outside the cellar door, his payment envelope unopened. Margaret told them he had been called away to another estate. No one questioned her. The cellar was sealed that same afternoon, the boards nailed down so tightly the wood splintered. The smell faded in a week, replaced by the soft fragrance of the garden's blooms. Years later, when curious hands would pry those boards up again, they would find the sacks untouched, still labeled, still preserved, each marked not by date alone but by the careful hand of someone who saw flesh and soil as the same thing, something to cultivate, something to store. Beneath the linen, the pulp had dried into brittle shapes like fruit left too long in the sun. And yet, when the lantern light touched it, the surface glimmered faintly as though it remembered being alive. When they came for the Vance estate, it was already too late for memory to protect it. The garden had long since devoured its own secrets, but time, like rot, has a patient hunger. The investigators arrived in 1912. Young men from the new Agricultural Bureau, their boots clean, their notebooks fresh. They were there to study soil anomalies, a polite phrase for the kind of fertility that made crops grow unnaturally tall. Wheat that shimmered gold weeks before harvest, vegetables that refused to wilt. Roses that bloomed crimson in winter. The townspeople whispered again about the house that never died, the one where the earth never stopped feeding itself. Behind the barn, beneath layers of vine and rust, they found the instruments. They were not quite machines, not quite tools. They seemed born of both. Iron hooks and copper tubing fused together, mechanisms that looked like they had been meant to plow but had been repurposed to pierce. The first one they uncovered was shaped like a small cradle, made of interlocking rings that could be tightened by a hand crank. Leather straps had fossilized across its surface, Nearby, a cluster of thin pipes ended in needles. Each was labeled with faint initials engraved with the precision of a surgeon. They did not look abandoned. They looked paused, as if waiting for hands that never returned. The investigators took photographs that day, though most of the plates would later vanish. They wrote that the devices appeared experimental in nature, an attempt to sustain organic function beyond expiration. In the barn's shadow, the floorboards were scorched where fires had once burned, yet beneath the ash, glass jars remained intact. Each jar contained residue, brown, gelatinous, sealed tight as if preserving a secret too dense to decay. On their lids, faded ink scrawled the same word again and again: elixir. What they did not know, what no record captured, was that Margaret Vance had called her devices the instruments of grace. In her private writings, later found bound in oilcloth beneath her bedroom floor, she described her belief in precise, mathematical mercy. Death, she wrote, was wasteful when left to chaos. The body, stripped of pulse, could still serve a purpose if guided correctly. Its essence transferred, refined, returned to the living. She believed the garden understood this. It was not hunger that drove her, but order. The dead owe the living their use, she wrote in a hand so steady it looked mechanical. Each season she had chosen her donors carefully. The lonely, the forgotten, those with no kin to claim them. She saw herself not as a killer but as a keeper of balance. Her instruments, she believed, were the bridge between nature and eternity. They sustained life not as it was, but as it could be, repurposed, concentrated. She had studied anatomy books, farming manuals, and religious tracts alike, merging them into a single faith. She wrote of rooting the spirit, of blood turned to seed. The investigators' notes never captured the smell that lingered inside the barn. Sweet, metallic, faintly floral, as if decay and perfume had mingled until they were indistinguishable. On one wall they found iron loops bolted into the wood at perfect intervals like a grid. Each loop bore a small dent, where something once strained against it. Beneath them, shallow troughs had been carved into the dirt, sloping toward a drain that led to the garden. The pipe connecting them was copper, darkened but intact. When they opened the hatch outside, they found its mouth buried in the roots of the oldest tree, the one that never shed its leaves. They did not see her vision. To Margaret it had been elegant. She had believed herself a gardener of souls, her instruments the tools of a higher craft. She had worked by candlelight, her hands always steady, her thoughts clear. When the process was complete, when the serum thickened and cooled, she would carry it in glass vials to the garden and inject it into the soil, one measured drop at a time. The plants had responded with unnatural vigor, their roots deep and warm to the touch. She took it as proof that the cycle worked. To her, death was not an ending but a refinement, the soul distilled, the flesh repurposed, the garden reborn. As the investigators catalogued each device, the youngest of them, a boy barely 20, began to tremble. He pointed out that the crankshafts were too small for farm use, too deliberate in their shaping. The measurements were wrong for animals. One of the older men, a doctor's son, noticed the curvature of the restraints, not shaped for limbs that bent in hooves or paws, but for arms, shoulders, ribs. He turned away and said nothing. That evening, they buried their findings in reports written in the passive voice. Words like peculiar, uncertain, and anomalous filled the pages where the truth should have been. Yet the garden kept growing. Even as the house crumbled and ivy overtook the walls, the soil remained black and breathing. Locals said it pulsed at night when the moon was low. They claimed to see faint trails of light between the barn and the trees, as though the land still remembered its feeder. Some nights the wind through the grass carried a hum, almost mechanical, rising and falling like something beneath the ground still turning its gears. When the last investigator left, he turned once toward the barn. He would later write that he felt watched not by ghosts but by a system, something vast, patient, and orderly, something that did not care for guilt or grief, only for continuation. And in the quiet of that land, under centuries of dust, the instruments of Margaret Vance still waited. Iron teeth dulled but not broken, copper veins still twined through the soil. Their purpose was never hunger. It was precision, preservation, the methodical mercy of a mind that believed life should never be allowed to end, only changed, refined, and returned to the earth that made it. By the summer of 1873, The Vance estate seemed quieter than it had ever been. The air over the fields shimmered with heat, and cicadas screamed endlessly in the trees, as though the world itself was trying to drown out a truth it could no longer bear to hear. Henry Vance had grown into a pale, watchful boy of 16, all hollow eyes and cautious movements, a child raised among ghosts he had never been allowed to name. His mother's presence filled every inch of the house, her scent in the halls, her words etched into the silverware, her rules stitched into the curtains. But the silence beneath it was his alone. He had begun to notice things no one else did. The garden's hum at night, the way the air seemed thicker when he tried to sleep, the faint pulse beneath the soil that felt disturbingly alive. It began with a creak under the floorboards. While searching for a missing candle holder, Henry pried open a section of wood beneath his mother's study and found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, sealed tight with wax the color of dried blood. Inside were several notebooks, iron fragile, handwritten, their pages sticky and red-edged. The writing was his mother's, though it looked more like scripture than science. At first he thought the stains were ink until he realized they glistened faintly in the candlelight. He could smell the iron. Blood. His name appeared in the margins, sometimes paired with words he didn't understand: root ratio, host resilience, yield potential. Each page was worse than the last. Diagrams of the human body labeled like the anatomy of a field, arteries called irrigation lines, bones called trellises, organs described as compost. Her language was calm, methodical, and strangely tender. She had written about the devotion of the flesh, how every person, willingly or not, owed themselves to the continuation of life. One passage chilled him more than the rest. A son is the soil perfected. Through him the cycle remains pure. Henry's hands shook as he turned the final page. There, sketched in precise detail, was a ritual, a formula mixing blood, ash, and sap, meant to bind the body to the earth's pulse. The instructions ended with a warning written in crimson. Never break the root. The land remembers he could not breathe. Every fiber of him screamed that this was wrong, evil, an abomination pretending to be order. That night, while his mother slept, Henry carried the notebooks to the garden. The moon was high, silvering the grass and casting long, skeletal shadows. He dug a pit behind the roses, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves. One by one he tore the pages and threw them in, his hands trembling. When the last notebook fell, he lit a match. The paper caught instantly, flaring bright. But before the flames could rise, a gust of wind tore through the garden, so strong it knocked him backward. The fire died. The ashes settled into the soil, vanishing before his eyes. The ground began to move. Not a tremor, a breathing. The soil lifted and fell as though lungs hidden beneath it were gasping for air. Henry scrambled back, his heart pounding. He heard it then, the faintest whisper like the rustle of roots through dirt. Dozens of voices, soft but clear, speaking in tones of gratitude and pain. They thanked him for trying, begged him to stop, promised him mercy if he would just leave it buried. The sound came from all directions, like the entire garden had learned to speak. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the whispers crawled into his mind. When he looked down again, the roses had begun to twitch. Their stems bent toward him, leaves shivering as if reaching for his skin. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root that hadn't been there before. It coiled around his ankle like a hand, warm and pulsing. He tore free, running to the house, slamming the door behind him. But when he turned, his mother was already standing there in her nightdress, calm, smiling faintly, as though she had been expecting him. She told him she understood. That curiosity was a sign of strength, not rebellion. She said the garden had chosen him, that the land had accepted his bloodline as its keeper. "You heard them, didn't you?" she whispered. "They're at peace because of us. We give them meaning." Henry tried to protest, to shout that it wasn't peace, it was torment, but her eyes were so steady, so sure, that his voice failed. She spoke softly of the order of things, how nothing was truly lost, only transformed. She reminded him that his father's death had not been in vain, that his essence fed the soil now, keeping their harvest alive. She said the same could be true of everyone if guided by a steady hand. That night she brought him to the cellar. She showed him where the serum had been made, how the pipes connected from beneath the barn to the garden's roots. She placed his hand on the cold metal of the instruments and said, "The soil knows you. It remembers your kindness." He felt something move beneath his feet, a vibration that traveled up through his bones. He realized in that moment that the land did know him, and that it did not want to let him go. For weeks after, he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces blooming beneath the ground, their mouths opening soundlessly. Sometimes he woke to find soil beneath his nails or footprints leading from the garden to his bed. He told himself it wasn't real. But one morning he found a small root coiled on his pillow, pale, thin, and pulsing faintly like a vein. Henry burned it, but the smoke smelled sweet. Almost human. By the end of that summer, he had stopped resisting. His mother's notebooks were gone, but their knowledge remained inside him, seated in his mind. When he stood in the garden now, the soil seemed to hum in approval. He began to understand what his mother had meant. The idea that devotion was not love, but surrender. That life was not sacred, only recyclable. The whispers no longer frightened him. They guided him. In time, he too began to believe that the dead owed their use to the living. By autumn, the Vance estate had grown unnaturally lush. The drought that starved every neighboring farm never touched its borders. From the main road, travelers could see green stretching far past reason, corn standing taller than a man, blossoms still opening in cold air, soil that steamed faintly even in the frost. People called it a miracle. Others whispered that the Vances had made a covenant with the earth itself. When Dr. Abel Rowan arrived in October of 1873, he came not as a believer but as a man of science, or so he told himself. His curiosity had been sharpened by rumor and funded by the new agricultural board, who wanted proof of chemical innovation. But when his carriage stopped before the gate, and he saw the garden breathing with its slow pulse of windless motion, he felt a primitive doubt crawl into his bones. Margaret Vance greeted him like a queen in exile. Her dress was simple but immaculate, her face calm, untouched by the years since the war. She carried herself with the grace of someone whose faith had already been proven. Henry stood behind her, silent, taller now, his expression unreadable. Dr. Rowan made polite conversation, careful to hide his discomfort. Yet the longer he stayed, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The smell of the soil clung to his clothes, sweet, metallic, faintly rancid, like blood long dried. He began his study the next morning. He collected samples from the cornfield, scraping thin layers of earth into glass vials, slicing stalks to examine their sap. What he found disturbed him. The liquid that bled from the plants was too thick, too dark. When held to light, it shimmered red instead of green, forming a clot rather than dripping clean. Under magnification, he saw cell structures not of plant origin, fibrous, irregular, almost flesh-like. The soil, too, was wrong. Its granules stuck together slick with organic residue. When he washed it through cheesecloth, the runoff smelled like iron and salt. He dissected a cluster of roots next, carefully separating them under the lens. As his blade sliced through the fibers, a faint pulse shivered along their length, as if they recoiled. He leaned closer. Inside the largest root, he found something that stopped him cold. A sliver of bone, small and rounded like the tip of a human finger. Around it, the root tissue had grown in spirals, absorbing it completely. It wasn't decay. It was assimilation. The earth hadn't just been fed. It had learned to digest. By afternoon, his unease had deepened into terror disguised as curiosity. He gathered a handful of insects from the rosebed, fat, pale larvae that squirmed lazily in the soil. He crushed one between glass slides and found its gut full of marrow. Not leaf, not rot, marrow. The entire ecosystem had adapted to a new kind of sustenance. The garden lived on flesh. That evening, he sought Margaret out in her parlor. The firelight flickered across her calm face as he spoke. He explained what he'd seen, his voice shaking, scientific precision breaking down into disbelief. The soil is carnivorous, he said. It feeds through the roots. It takes what's human and makes it bloom. Margaret listened silently, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When he finished, she smiled faintly. "You speak of feeding," she said softly, as though it were sin. "But tell me, Doctor, what else is nature if not consumption perfected?" He tried to warn her that it was unnatural, that something monstrous had taken hold of her land, but she only looked past him, her gaze steady on the window where the garden swayed without wind. "I have merely helped it find its purpose," she said. "Every living thing wants to last. Even the earth hungers for that mercy." Dr. Rowan left the room shaken, but not before noticing the faint hum beneath his feet, a vibration so low it felt like a heartbeat. That night, he wrote furiously in his journal describing the evidence, the impossible life cycle, his intention to alert the authorities. He did not know that Margaret had already read every word before dawn. The next morning, she invited him to see the barn. "If you're to write your report," she said with polite warmth, "you must understand the process fully." Against his better judgment, he followed her. The air grew heavier as they neared the old structure. Inside, the walls glistened faintly with moisture, the smell of iron stronger now, metallic and sweet. Instruments hung in neat rows, curved iron tubing, gears, all oiled and ready despite decades of dust. In the center of the room, a table waited. Upon it, a strange contraption of copper rings and glass funnels gleamed in the half-light. Margaret gestured to it with reverence. "The harvest is not cruel," she said. "It's preservation. Every cell contains memory. The moment of death is wasteful, unless one learns to carry that memory forward." Her voice was gentle, almost maternal. Dr. Rowan tried to step back, but Henry stood at the door, his eyes empty. Margaret guided the doctor closer. "You wanted to see the truth," she whispered. "Now you will help me prove it." No one heard the struggle. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and the house swallowed sound like a grave. The journal entry he left behind, later found hidden in a glass jar beneath the roots of the oldest tree, told what happened next. He wrote that she had injected him with something clear, burning, that froze his veins but kept his heart alive. He could not move, but he could see. He described her working methodically, adjusting levers, whispering equations. He felt the breath leaving his body, yet his mind refused to fade. "She keeps me breathing in the roots," he wrote in jagged lines. "She says consciousness should not be wasted. I can feel the soil listening. It hums my heartbeat." Days later, when the authorities arrived to retrieve him, summoned by a half-written letter he'd mailed before that final visit, they found no trace of the doctor, only his discarded spectacles near the garden's edge. But weeks afterward, when the autumn rains came, a strange growth appeared near the cornfield, a vine unlike any other, winding up through the soil with thin, translucent leaves. When villagers walked past at night, they swore they could hear faint breathing beneath its roots. The Vance estate was declared under study, though no one dared to stay long enough to finish the report. The garden never withered. It only grew thicker, redder, richer. Somewhere beneath its roots, something remembered the sound of its own lungs. Winter came slowly to the Vance estate that year, but Margaret Vance felt it before the frost touched the fields. Her skin grew pale, her hands trembled, her once calm breath began to rasp at night like a blade dragged over stone. For the first time, the garden did not seem to recognize her. Its hum grew softer, its pulse uneven. She would stand at the window and whisper to the soil, but the vines did not move, the air did not answer. The bond she had forged, the quiet exchange between her blood and the land's hunger, had begun to falter. She was dying, and the garden could not save her. Henry watched from a distance, his face a careful mask of grief and calculation. He had spent years in his mother's shadow, first resisting, then learning, and finally understanding. But now, standing in the doorway of her darkened room, he felt something colder than sorrow: curiosity. Death, his mother had always said, was only a transfer of use. She had given that truth to him, seeded it in his mind like a germ that grew with every heartbeat. As she weakened, he began to wonder whether the garden would allow him to take her place, or whether it required her to fall first. The sickness spread fast. Within weeks, Margaret could no longer leave her bed. Her once precise hands shook uncontrollably. Her eyes, once sharp, turned glassy and sunken. But she was not delirious. Even in her frailty, she spoke of continuity. "The soil must always have a keeper," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "The body is the vessel. The method never dies." She pressed a trembling hand to Henry's chest. "The work is yours now." When she fell unconscious, Henry moved methodically. He gathered her notebooks, the ones he had once burned and the ones she had rewritten since, and studied them by candlelight. The formulas were clear, rational, almost clinical. They spoke not of magic, but of biology. Transference through blood filtration, preservation through chemical balance, vitality drawn cell by cell, like nourishment from the dying. It was not witchcraft. It was efficiency. Margaret had discovered a parasite that mimicked devotion. The soil did not worship her. It consumed her, and she had allowed it. That night, Henry decided to continue the work, but on his own terms. He cleaned the instruments, arranged the copper funnels and glass jars with the precision of a surgeon. The air in the cellar was cold, the scent of rust and ash lingering like memory. His mother lay upon the table, her breath shallow, her skin already fading to gray. He whispered to her softly, telling her that he would not let her suffer, that he would make it clean, perfect, merciful. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He began the process exactly as her notes described. The transfusion lines filled slowly, the fluid traveling through the narrow glass tubes, glimmering dark red under the candlelight. The serum that had once nourished the garden now flowed into his own veins, diluted, purified, systematized. He felt warmth spreading through his body, a dull pressure in his chest, a tightening behind his eyes. His pulse quickened, then slowed, as if syncing with a rhythm beyond his own. He looked down at her and realized that the light had already left her face. There was no ceremony, no wailing, no guilt. When it was done, he cleaned the table and buried her beneath the oldest tree, where the roots ran deepest. As he covered her body, the soil seemed to stir faintly, like an exhale. The garden recognized him now. In the weeks that followed, Henry refined everything. He replaced crude tubing with surgical precision, replaced pain with sedation, replaced cruelty with control. He learned to measure the serum's potency, to adjust its strength for specific crops. He took notes, meticulous and detached, recording reactions in the soil and in his own blood. He no longer saw horror in the work and only order. The grotesque had become the logical. The screams his mother once silenced, he erased entirely. Where she had acted with faith, he acted with science. The estate changed with him. The garden no longer pulsed with wild hunger. It thrummed with steady rhythm, like a machine calibrated to perfection. The plants grew predictably now, each leaf symmetrical, each flower exact. There were no more spontaneous miracles, only results. The garden had evolved, and so had its master. At night, Henry would sit by the cellar door listening. Sometimes he heard faint murmurs beneath the soil, fragments of his mother's voice entwined with countless others, the chorus of devotion she had cultivated for years. But he no longer felt fear. He understood now that those voices were not trapped souls but echoes of utility, the aftersound of transformation. They spoke not in suffering but in purpose, and he believed in purpose. One evening, as he walked the fields, a strange stillness settled over the land. The moon hung low, painting everything in cold silver. He pressed his palm to the soil and felt it thrum, not weakly, not hungrily, but patiently. It was no longer taking from him. It was in balance. The transfer had succeeded. He was its keeper, its system, its equilibrium. For the first time in his life, Henry smiled. There was no madness in it, no ecstasy, only satisfaction. He wrote in his ledger that night, "She believed the garden was a miracle. I see now it is a machine. Life feeds upon life, as always. I have merely given it precision." When dawn came, the first frost of winter crept over the fields, yet the soil beneath remained warm, soft, and alive. From beneath the tree where Margaret was buried, a single sprout pushed through the earth, pale and veined like human skin. Henry watched it rise, and for a moment he thought he saw her eyes in its surface. Calm, approving, endless. He reached down, touched it gently, and whispered, "You've given enough." But the plant shivered once, almost like laughter, and turned its leaves toward him. By spring, the garden would bear fruit unlike any seen before, smooth, perfect, silent. And though no one else would ever know what grew within, Henry would tend to it with reverence. The work would continue, but without cruelty, without waste, without remorse. He had perfected his mother's sin. The fog over Caldwell never used to stay past dawn. In the years before the war, it would lift with the first sunlight, rolling away from the wheat fields like a ghost ashamed to linger. But now, even at noon, the mist clung to the streets, thick, pale, and sour with the smell of damp iron. The townsfolk said it was the weather, the new fertilizer, or God's changing temper. No one mentioned the Vance estate. At first, it was only fatigue. The blacksmith's boy fainted during work. The schoolmistress found herself short of breath climbing stairs. Children napped at their desks. Old men dozed in the middle of sermons. The town doctor, a soft-spoken man named Alcott, called it general anemia. He prescribed tonics of molasses and liver extract, and the townsfolk dutifully swallowed their cures, their faces growing paler by the week. The fainting spells multiplied. So did the funerals. Meanwhile, the Vance farm prospered. Even through dry seasons, its crops glistened with unnatural color. The tomatoes grew redder than blood. The wheat bent heavy with golden grain. While Caldwell's field struggled with rot and frost, the Vance harvest never failed. When the townspeople asked how Henry managed it, he would only smile and say, "My mother left me good soil," and they believed him, because believing otherwise would mean questioning their own survival. The Vances supplied food to nearly every home in Caldwell. Their produce filled the grocer's shelves. Their donations stocked the church pantry. Even as the townsfolk grew frail, they ate from the Vance estate with gratitude. A strange quiet settled over the valley, a hush of mutual benefit and unspoken dread. Dr. Alcott began to notice patterns. Those who consumed the most from the Vance shipments suffered the worst symptoms: pale gums, slow heartbeats, the peculiar glassiness of the eyes. He kept his notes discreet, unwilling to name what he suspected. When he mentioned it to the mayor, the response was swift and soft. "Henry Vance feeds half this town. If the soil is poisoned, then so are we all. Best let it be." So he let it be. The cemetery grew row upon row of simple wooden crosses. The gravedigger complained of shortness of breath too, though he laughed about it as he worked. The priest, who had once blessed the Vance home and vomited afterward, now avoided the subject entirely. "The Lord gives and takes as he wills," he told his congregation, though his eyes often drifted toward the fog beyond the windows. By the third year, Caldwell had stopped asking questions. The illness was part of life now, like winter or taxes or the whisper that came when the wind turned east. People learned to live slower. They carried small flasks of honey water, napped often, spoke less. Their skin lost its warmth, but their manners remained polite. They didn't fear death. They simply adjusted to it. Henry Vance became a local figure of admiration. He donated funds for the new schoolhouse, paid for the doctor's supplies, and hired dozens of weakened men to work the edges of his property. Light tasks, he promised, paid well. They would return home exhausted but content, their boots caked with rich black soil. Some swore they could feel the earth hum beneath their feet like a heartbeat. None of them lasted long. Their families received fresh produce in compensation, and so the town survived. The economy flourished. The people, frail though they were, endured quietly, as if their collective weakness was the price of peace. The Vance estate became not a source of suspicion but of pride. Visitors from neighboring counties remarked on Caldwell's thriving fields, its strange vitality amid decay. "A blessed town," they said. "God must favor your land." The people nodded, careful not to breathe too deeply. Only the children seemed to notice the wrongness. They whispered of hearing murmurs through the soil, of seeing faces in the fog. One little girl claimed she saw her dead grandmother waving from the fields at dusk. Her mother hushed her and said prayers until her lips bled. As years passed, the town forgot the names of the first to fall ill. The illness itself lost its name too. It became simply the weariness. And when newcomers asked about the ever-present mist, the townsfolk smiled with hollow courtesy and said, "You get used to it." Henry grew older, but never sick. His face remained colorless, his eyes calm and dry. He rarely visited town now. The estate seemed to contain everything he needed. The people assumed he was busy, planting, tending, improving. No one dared ask. In the final week of autumn, Dr. Alcott's journal ended abruptly. His last note read, "The fog is thicker now. I woke with soil beneath my nails and don't recall leaving my bed." The town doesn't breathe anymore, and it sighs. After that, no one mentioned him again. His house remained untouched, his garden overgrown, his door forever ajar. Children avoided it on their way to school. By winter's first frost, Caldwell's fog had turned almost crimson in the dawn light. The air felt heavier, sweeter. The crops from the Vance estate tasted faintly metallic, but no one complained. They were alive, and that was enough. Evil no longer needed to hide. It had been woven into the fabric of the town, polite, silent, and self-sustaining. Caldwell had learned to live without breath. The storm began without warning. a wall of rain that seemed to rise from the ground rather than fall from the sky. For 2 days and nights, the heavens bled over Caldwell. The townsfolk stayed inside, candles trembling in the damp air, listening to the endless hiss of water against wood. When the flood finally receded, the valley looked flayed open. Mudslides carved through the Vance estate, tearing away hedges, fences, and the roots of that infamous garden that had never died. Beneath the churned soil, the earth began to show its memory. By dawn, the first body surfaced, not rotten, not skeletal, but preserved. The flesh was pale and firm, almost waxen, the eyes sealed as though in sleep. A farmhand spotted it tangled among the bean vines and screamed. When the sheriff arrived, he found more, dozens, maybe hundreds, embedded in the soil like a crop that had grown upward instead of down. Each body wrapped in linen, stitched neatly, tagged with small brass plates engraved with dates and letters. The flood had unearthed the harvest. News spread like infection. Caldwell's streets filled with whispering crowds, pale faces staring toward the hill where the Vance home stood empty. Henry was nowhere to be found. His servants had fled weeks earlier, claiming he had grown strange, talking to the walls, measuring their breath, keeping jars of his own blood on the windowsill to feed the dawn. No one had believed them then. Now, with the ground vomiting corpses, their words returned like prophecy. Authorities from Lexington arrived days later, led by a young deputy named Mercer. He was practical, sharp, and too inexperienced to fear what he didn't yet understand. He documented everything with care, the positioning of each body, the identical stitching, the soil's uncanny condition. The linen did not decay when cut. The air smelled of iron and sap. Beneath the main cellar, he found shelves of glass jars containing fluids that shimmered green under lamplight, each labeled meticulously, Stage 3 serum, root extract, infant tissue, lot number 6. He wrote in his log, not murder, something else. In Henry's study, they discovered the journals. 6 of them, bound in calfskin, numbered with Roman numerals, the pages filled with tight, deliberate handwriting. They read less like a diary and more like an autopsy of the human soul. The entries began with simple agricultural notes, experiments in soil density, decay rates, organic absorption. But soon they spiraled into something else. The marrow carries a light no crop can hold. The body resists death only when given purpose. Mother's method was crude. The key is consent of the flesh. The later entries were colder, more precise. Henry described transfer equations, ratios of human serum to nutrient base, instructions for mechanical irrigation of living tissue. He referred to the bodies as donors, the soil as the cradle, and himself as the steward. In the margins, small sketches of devices appeared, steel tubes fitted with ribbed joints, pumps resembling lungs, vats shaped like hearts. The handwriting remained calm throughout, even as the content turned monstrous. It was as if he were documenting weather patterns, not agony. One passage stood out: death is inefficient. Preservation through transformation is mercy. Each vessel continues, dispersed, reimagined, sustaining the living through the medium of the earth. The garden is their choir. Another, later in the volume, read, Mother believed in sacrifice. I believe in utility. Every death must yield. The journals also contained fragments of conversation, lines written as if remembered or imagined. They thank me in their sleep, one read. The soil sings when fed. Mercer copied them word for word. The other investigators, hardened men, refused to read past the first volume. One vomited. Another quit the force within a week. The church arrived next. Father Cleary, trembling but resolute, declared the site cursed. He blessed each uncovered body and demanded they be burned, claiming the soil had become a vessel for demonic will. The sheriff refused, citing evidence preservation. The argument ended when Cleary fainted in the garden, choking on his own breath. He survived, but his voice never returned. Scientists from the state university came later. They approached it clinically, taking samples of the soil, the fluids, and even fragments of the devices. Their findings, sealed for decades, described an unknown organic suspension exhibiting parasitic vitality. Under the microscope, the samples pulsed faintly as if reacting to light. The lead scientist labeled it biological lunacy. His assistant, a devout man, called it proof of the devil. Neither was correct. Weeks turned to months. The Vance estate was stripped bare, the journals sent to archives in Louisville. The townsfolk returned to their slow routines, though the air around Caldwell never felt clean again. Crops refused to grow on the hill, and the fog, once white, became the color of dull bone. The river silt turned thick, sluggish, metallic. Children who played near the ruins developed strange rashes that glowed faintly at night, like bruises remembering something. Henry Vance himself was never found. Some said he drowned in the flood. Others whispered he dissolved into the soil, completing the ritual he perfected. A few claimed to see him walking through the mist months later, a tall, lean figure whose footsteps left no prints, whose breath froze in the summer air. In 1883, the government sealed the property. Official records labeled it the Vance Agricultural Experiment, citing gross misconduct and contamination. But the locals never used that name. To them it remained the house that fed itself. In time, a memorial was built on the edge of the property, a stone plaque bearing only one line from Henry's final journal. The dead owe the living their use. The words were meant to condemn him. Yet standing in the quiet field, one could almost mistake them for faith. Decades later, when historians reopened the case, they found the journals brittle but intact. They concluded that Henry's horror had never been supernatural at all. It was the product of devotion, to his mother, to progress, to the illusion that life could be controlled if only one dared to dissect it deeply enough. Evil, they wrote, had worn the face of reason. The flood had exposed more than bodies. It had revealed a truth that civilized society preferred to forget. That cruelty, when organized and methodical, no longer feels like sin. It feels like science. And so the Vance legacy faded into mud, its confession unearthed, read, and filed away. Caldwell rebuilt, though its people still moved slowly, breathing shallowly as if afraid to draw too much air from the soil that once fed them. The garden had stopped growing, but beneath the ground something still hummed, faint, rhythmic, patient. What do you think? Could this happen again? By the turn of the century, Caldwell had forgotten the names that once made its children tremble. The Vance estate was gone, the manor collapsed, its roof long since devoured by ivy and rot. Only the garden remained, stubborn and silent. Where the old paths had been, rows of green still pulsed with unnatural life. No one tended them. No hands planted or harvested. Yet every spring, the ground swelled and breathed as though the roots below still remembered their purpose. Farmers who lived on the outskirts spoke of strange noises drifting from the hill at night. A low hum, soft and constant, like hundreds of insects whispering in unison. Those who dared climb near the ruins swore the plants trembled when approached, their leaves curling inward as if shy. Once a boy cut a single tomato from the edge of the property and brought it home in triumph. His mother sliced it open for supper, only to drop the knife. Inside, the pulp shimmered faintly, the color of diluted blood, and the flesh emitted a faint vibration. She buried it behind the barn that same night. The boy never went near the hill again. By 1903, a small team of scientists from the State Agricultural Board visited the site. They came with shovels, glass jars, and modern confidence. They expected to find residue, perhaps chemical waste from the old Vance experiments. What they discovered unsettled even their clinical curiosity. The soil samples, when examined under a microscope, revealed traces of hemoglobin, human in origin, perfectly preserved. The texture of the dirt was soft, almost oily, and it seemed to pulse faintly when warmed. The report, later buried in bureaucratic archives, described the land as organically self-sustaining through an unidentified biological medium. One researcher resigned immediately after filing it. Another kept a jar of the soil on his desk until his death, insisting it moved when no one was watching. Caldwell's people learned to live around the hill, not with it. They built new farms further east where the ground felt clean. The fog, though thinner now, still gathered above the ruins at dusk, hanging there like an unanswered question. Children were warned never to play near the old property, not out of superstition, but because, as their parents said, it remembers who steps there. The few who ignored the warning returned pale, disoriented, claiming they heard music beneath their feet. The Vance name, once whispered in fear, became folklore, a cautionary echo of scientific pride. Locals told stories at taverns that the Vances had tried to outsmart death, that their souls had merged with the soil, that the earth itself was now alive with their hunger. Some said the garden fed on memory. Others claimed it simply waited for new caretakers. None returned to find out. The town prospered modestly, but Caldwell never grew beyond its quiet limits. It remained a place where people walked softly, where the fog rolled in too early, and where every farmer looked uneasily at the color of his crops. No matter how far they built, the shadow of that garden stretched beneath their fields, an unseen, patient humming. Over time, nature reclaimed the ruins. The house collapsed completely, its foundation smothered by vines and wildflowers. The garden spread outward, blending into the countryside, its borders lost but its presence unmistakable. Even when lightning struck the hill in 1912, setting the grass aflame, the soil beneath remained cool, untouched. The fire burned in a perfect circle, sparing the heart of the garden. Witnesses swore it was as if the land refused to die. By 1920, the last of the original Caldwell families had moved away. The town's name faded from maps, its buildings left to dust and ivy. Only travelers passing through noticed the anomaly. The way the wind seemed to slow when crossing the valley, how the air grew warmer and sweet, how their footsteps echoed softly against the ground. A few claimed they heard breathing. In the quiet years that followed, the legend of the Vance estate transformed into something gentler, almost reverent. Folklorists called it the hum of life. Writers romanticized it as nature reclaiming its debt. None of them knew the truth, that the soil's hum was not life at all, but remembrance. Even now, long after Caldwell ceased to exist, the hill still blooms. The garden that never died continues to grow, season after season, without sunlight, without care, without mercy. Evil, it seems, does not vanish. It roots itself deep enough to outlive those who name it. 100 years after the last Vance house collapsed into the earth, progress returned to Caldwell, not as people, but as investigators. The town no longer existed on maps, only as a faint grid of forgotten roads. In 1982, a construction crew widening the state highway struck something deep beneath the hillside. Layers of preserved organic matter sealed in black clay. Forensic teams arrived expecting animal remains. What they found rewrote a century of silence. The bodies were not simply buried. They were arranged, catalogued, connected by rusted tubes and glass fragments, as if a vast system once pulsed through the ground. The soil surrounding them was unnaturally rich in human proteins. The reports called it biofertilization of human origin. When federal archives were opened for cross-reference, the name Vance appeared in old state ledgers, tied to agricultural research in the 1870s. What began as local horror now looked like the seed of something larger. Historians uncovered correspondences between Margaret Vance and several early medical pioneers. Men later celebrated for breakthroughs in blood preservation, organ vitality, and chemical anesthesia. Her letters, recovered from private collections, spoke of experiments in sympathetic growth and the communion between human cells and crop vitality. They were clinical, detached, and eerily familiar to modern scientific language. Though most dismissed them as eccentric ramblings, a few recognized the pattern. What Margaret began as ritual, others continued as science. By 1905, her theories had quietly traveled through academic channels, stripped of their origins and rewritten as biological efficiency models. Laboratories across the country experimented with ways to prolong cellular life, to keep tissue alive after separation. Some of those methods, later condemned at Nuremberg, bore uncanny resemblance to the notes found in the Vance journals. The Vance estate had been erased from record, but its philosophy endured. Not through cults or bloodlines, but through logic itself. The belief that death could be managed, that human suffering could be justified if labeled progress. When these findings reached the public, outrage followed. The government sealed the original soil samples. Universities withdrew related publications. A memorial committee was formed in Kentucky, and by 1987, a stone monument stood on the hill where the garden once grew. It bore no names, only an inscription: "To those consumed by the hunger for betterment." Local families attended the ceremony with lowered eyes. A few old residents whispered that the ground vibrated underfoot during the speeches, as if remembering. In the following years, the Vance case became a study in ethics. Law schools referenced it as the beginning of biomoral regulation, a reminder of how easily empathy can be replaced with purpose. But even as new laws were written, laboratories across the world continued to blur the same boundaries, growing organs in artificial wombs, harvesting cells from the near-dead, feeding progress with what the living left behind. None of them spoke the Vance name, yet her shadow lingered in every sterile corridor. By the early 2000s, journalists revisited the Caldwell site. They filmed the cracked memorial, the barren hill, the faint hum recorded through the soil when rain struck its surface. Scientists called it geological resonance, trapped air beneath sediment vibrating under pressure. Locals who still remembered the stories said otherwise. They claimed the sound was breathing. Time smoothed the scandal into history. The journals now rest in climate-controlled vaults, sealed behind ethical warnings. Scholars still debate whether Margaret was mad, brilliant, or both. Some call her the first bioengineer. Others call her the devil's botanist. But what endures most is not her cruelty. It is the quiet logic that made it possible. She never killed for chaos or greed. She killed to improve. And the world, in its hunger for advancement, quietly agreed with her long before it knew her name. Now the Vance Hill lies under weeds and rain, unmarked except for the stone. Travelers who stop there speak of a strange sweetness in the air, of a faint tremor beneath their boots. They say that when storms pass over the valley, the soil hums, soft, rhythmic, patient, as if remembering every breath it ever took. Perhaps evil doesn't end, it adapts. It learns the language of science, buries itself beneath progress, and waits for the next mind brave enough to listen. What do you think? Could this happen again, when science learns to call cruelty innovation?